She stood at the altar with the perfect smile, but just before the vows, a 9-year-old shouted, "She's lying." Gabriel Stone stood at the front of the cathedral, his back straight, his dark suit pressed to perfection, his expression calm, though inside his thoughts spun in circles. At 34, he had built everything he had from nothing, first through late nights and endless study, then through bold investments and clever strategies that had turned his technology firm into a giant. Today was supposed to be his reward, the moment where he joined his personal life to his professional success, marrying Serena Vale, the woman who had seemed to walk into his life as if sent by fate. The cathedral was dressed in flowers, the tall windows streaming colored light down onto rows of polished pews filled with family, friends, and important figures from business and politics. Guests whispered about how perfect the couple looked, how handsome and serious Gabriel was, how radiant Serena appeared in her gown, her every movement graceful, her smile gentle but commanding. Serena stood beside him, her veil a soft shimmer over her features, her hand holding her bouquet with steady confidence. She looked like a dream that had stepped from a magazine, the sort of woman everyone expected a man like Gabriel to marry. His mind tried to rest in that thought, in the idea of peace and completion, but something inside him remained unsettled. He told himself it was nerves, nothing more. The eyes of the world were on him, after all. Down in the pews, near the front but not close enough to be the center of attention, Lily Hart sat stiff and small, her legs swinging above the ground because they did not quite reach the floor. At 9 years old, she had already lived more lives than most adults, and though Gabriel had legally adopted her after his sister's death, she still sometimes felt like a guest in his world, unsure if her place was permanent. She clutched a small spiral notebook to her chest, her knuckles white around the edges. Inside, she had written in neat but uneven handwriting things she had noticed about Serena, little details that pricked her skin with unease. Lily was quiet by nature, a watcher more than a talker, and her habit of noticing small things had once kept her safe in places that were not safe at all. She had noticed Serena's late-night phone calls, the way her eyes sometimes hardened when she thought no one was looking, the small camera light that had blinked from a device hidden in the corner of Gabriel's office. She had written it all down, because saying it out loud was too frightening, and because Gabriel always seemed so certain when Serena smiled at him. The music swelled from the organ, filling the air with a weight that made Lily's stomach twist. She looked up at Gabriel, tall and proud, and wondered if he really saw Serena, or only the image she showed him. Around her, guests leaned toward one another, whispering about the beauty of the ceremony, the wealth that shimmered in every detail, the fairy tale union that seemed so perfect. But Lily shifted on the wooden pew, clutching her notebook tighter, knowing that fairy tales were often disguises for something darker, and knowing too that before this day was over, she would not be able to stay silent. Lily sat quietly in her room the night before the wedding, her small legs folded beneath her on the wide window seat that overlooked the glowing gardens. Gabriel had given her this room when he brought her into his home, and it was bigger than any place she had ever lived before. The walls were painted soft blue, there were shelves filled with books she had picked herself, and the bedspread was thick and warm. But even with all that comfort, she often felt like a visitor who might be asked to pack up at any moment. A year had passed since her mother's death, and though Gabriel had signed the papers and told her she was his responsibility now, Lily still struggled to believe that she truly belonged. He was kind in his quiet way, but he was also distant, his mind always filled with numbers and screens and the weight of running a company worth millions. She had learned to rely on the one skill that had always kept her safe: watching. In the foster homes where she stayed before Gabriel, watching meant survival, knowing which adults were kind and which were dangerous, which children would share food and which would steal from you. Watching had taught her how to read the smallest details, the flick of an eye, the curve of a smile, the pause before a sentence. She noticed what others ignored, and though most people dismissed her because she was small and quiet, her eyes missed nothing. Serena Vale had entered their lives like a bright light, sweeping into the mansion with her laughter and perfume, her endless charm, and her promises of happiness. Everyone seemed enchanted by her. Gabriel softened when she was around, his serious features easing into smiles, his careful words replaced with warmth he rarely showed anyone else. Guests praised her grace. Reporters admired her style. And even the staff looked at her as if she was already mistress of the house. Only Lily seemed to notice what hid beneath the beauty. There was the way Serena's smiles never reached her eyes, her lips curving perfectly while her gaze stayed cold, measuring. There were the phone calls she made behind locked doors late at night, speaking in a hushed voice, ending the moment Gabriel returned. There were the times she asked Lily seemingly harmless questions about Gabriel's schedule, what time he left for meetings, who came by the house when he was gone. Questions that did not sound like curiosity, but like something else. And then there was the most troubling thing of all, Serena's sudden knowledge of Gabriel's business details. Lily had heard her repeating phrases about contracts and algorithms, things Lily had overheard Gabriel discussing on private calls. She should not have known those things, not unless she had been listening somehow, not unless she had reasons beyond love. Lily wrote these details in her notebook, her handwriting small and careful, the pages filling with quiet observations that no one else seemed to care about. She was shy, and she knew adults rarely listened to children, especially children like her, but her unease grew heavier each day. Tomorrow Gabriel would stand at the altar and give everything to Serena. Tomorrow, if no one else spoke, she might have to be the one to break the silence. The cathedral was hushed, except for the deep sound of the organ that slowly faded into silence. Gabriel stood tall at the altar, his hand steady as he held Serena's, his dark eyes calm on the surface, though his chest rose with the rhythm of nerves he tried to ignore. Serena looked flawless, her veil catching the light from the stained glass, her smile poised as though she had practiced it in a mirror. The priest spoke in a warm voice, his words echoing through the high arches, and the guests leaned forward, eager to witness the moment they had all gathered to see. Gabriel repeated his vows with steady conviction, each word pronounced clearly, his voice carrying across the chapel. He had never been a man to hesitate once a decision was made, and marrying Serena was the step he had told himself was right. She represented beauty, grace, and a kind of certainty he thought he needed. When the priest turned to her, asking if she would take Gabriel Stone as her husband, Serena's lips parted, ready to answer with the promise everyone expected. But before her words could leave her mouth, a small voice cut through the silence. Lily, trembling but determined, bolted from her seat. Her black shoes tapped loudly against the aisle floor as she ran, her notebook clutched tightly in her hand. She reached the center of the cathedral, her small frame dwarfed by the towering pillars, and her voice rose, sharp and frightened, echoing through the air. "She's lying about the vows." The gasp that followed was like a wave crashing across the crowd. Guests turned their heads, whispers rising like rustling leaves, confusion and shock painted on their faces. The priest froze mid-sentence, his book lowering slightly as he stared at the child standing in front of the altar. Gabriel's head snapped toward her, disbelief flashing in his eyes. Serena's fingers tightened around his hand, her knuckles white, though her face remained perfectly composed. Lily's chest rose and fell quickly as she stood in the aisle, tears shining in her eyes, but her voice unwavering now that it had been spoken. "She doesn't mean it," she said, her gaze fixed on Gabriel. "She's pretending." "She doesn't love you." The words fell like stones in the quiet space, breaking apart the illusion of perfection that had hung over the ceremony. Serena reacted quickly, bending slightly toward Gabriel as though to shield herself from the child's accusation. Her voice trembled with just enough fragility to stir sympathy. "She's confused," Serena whispered, loud enough for those in the front pews to hear. "She's been through so much, Gabriel. She doesn't understand what she's saying." But Lily shook her head fiercely, holding out her notebook with both hands as if it were proof no one could ignore. "I've been watching," she said, her words ringing with a child's unpolished honesty. "She lies when you're not here. She talks to someone else. She's not telling the truth." The cathedral swirled with voices, guests whispering, shifting, some looking at Gabriel with pity, others with curiosity, all waiting to see what he would do. Gabriel's face was pale now, his calm shaken, his gaze caught between the poised woman beside him and the trembling girl in front of him. For a man who had always trusted evidence and logic, It was the kind of moment that split the world in two. The silence in the cathedral was no longer peaceful but heavy and sharp, broken only by the low rustle of shocked whispers that spread like a ripple through the pews. Gabriel stood frozen at the altar, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. He had expected nerves, he had expected tears, but he had not expected his 9-year-old niece to run into the middle of his wedding and accuse his bride of lying. His hand remained in Serena's, but his eyes were fixed on Lily, who stood trembling, her notebook pressed against her chest as if it were armor. Serena's face was a study in control. For a moment, just a flicker, something sharp flashed across her eyes, a glint of irritation that did not belong in a bride's expression. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of perfect composure. She leaned closer to Gabriel, her voice low, but just loud enough for the nearest guest to hear, each syllable wrapped in concern. "She's overwhelmed, Gabriel. Poor child. She doesn't understand what she's saying. The crowd, the ceremony, it's too much for her." She squeezed his hand tightly, as if to anchor him, her nails biting into his skin in a way no one else could see. Lily, however, did not retreat. She stepped forward, her small hand reaching out to clutch Gabriel's sleeve, her voice trembling but fierce. "She doesn't love you," she whispered, but the urgency in her tone made it cut deeper than if she had shouted. "She's using you." Her eyes, wide and filled with tears, met his, and for the first time Gabriel saw not a frightened child, but a girl carrying the weight of truth she could no longer hold alone. The whispers in the pews grew louder. Some guests covered their mouths in shock. Others leaned forward with interest, watching the drama unfold as if it were theater. The priest shifted awkwardly, uncertain whether to step in or wait for Gabriel to act. Josephine Alvarez, the longtime housekeeper who had been like a quiet shadow of wisdom in Gabriel's life, sat straighter in her seat, her sharp gaze fixed on Serena, her expression unreadable. Gabriel's chest tightened. He wanted to comfort Lily, to protect her from the judgment of so many eyes, but Serena's hand on his arm tugged him back. Her voice, smooth and practiced, urged him to dismiss it all. "She's still grieving, Gabriel," she said with a tremor that sounded convincingly tender. "She's afraid of losing you too. Don't let her ruin this moment for us." Lily's grip on his sleeve tightened, her small fingers digging into the fabric. "Please listen," she begged softly. "Please believe me." Gabriel felt torn in two, the man who trusted evidence and logic caught between the woman who offered him everything he thought he wanted and the child who spoke with the raw, unpolished honesty he had never truly listened to before. The cathedral seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his choice, while the truth pressed heavier against his heart than the vows he was about to speak. The wedding did not move forward. The priest, caught between duty and uncertainty, closed his book and stepped back from the altar, his eyes flicking nervously between Gabriel, Serena, and the trembling child who had just shattered the ceremony. The music had stopped, the silence broken only by whispers that filled the cathedral like restless wind. Gabriel felt every pair of eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do, the weight of expectation pressing against his shoulders harder than the carved stone walls surrounding them. He bent down to Lily, his hand resting lightly on her arm, his voice low and careful. "Come with me," he murmured, his jaw tight, his tone steady enough to carry authority but soft enough to show concern. She clung to his sleeve as if afraid he might send her away if she let go, her small face pale and streaked with tears. Without another word, Gabriel led her a few steps down from the altar and into the side aisle, his movements stiff with tension. Behind them, Serena's voice followed, smooth yet sharpened with the right edge of wounded pride. "Gabriel," she called, her words trembling like a violin string. "Please, don't let her ruin what we've built. She's confused, she doesn't know what she's saying." She looked to the guests, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her lips curved in sorrow. It was a performance made to draw sympathy, and several guests nodded, whispering about the poor bride caught in a child's outburst. But Lily was not finished. She looked up at her uncle with eyes that seemed far too old for her small face, her chest rising and falling quickly. "I'm not confused," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "She doesn't love you. She's lying. She's using you." Each word cracked in the air like glass, and Gabriel felt them land against him, heavy and unrelenting. He crouched down so his eyes were level with hers, torn between the embarrassment of the scene unraveling in front of powerful people and the worry twisting inside him at her intensity. "Lily," he said quietly, "this isn't the time." He wanted to calm her, to keep her safe from the scrutiny of the crowd, but she shook her head with sudden stubbornness, clutching her notebook tighter against her chest. "Yes, it is," she said, her voice breaking but resolute. "If I wait, it will be too late. You'll believe her, and she'll take everything." Tears slid down her cheeks as she spoke, but she did not look away from him. Gabriel's heart clenched. He had always known Lily was observant, sharper than children her age should have to be, shaped by too many losses and too many places where she had not been believed. Now, in front of everyone, she was standing on that painful edge again, risking his rejection to protect him from something she saw more clearly than he wanted to admit. Behind him, Serena's voice rose once more, soft and breaking, painting herself as the victim. "She's overwhelmed, Gabriel. She's scared. Don't let her fear destroy what we've started." Her hand reached for him, elegant and steady. But Gabriel hesitated, torn between the polished woman who promised him a future and the small girl whose raw honesty demanded to be heard. The church was silent again, waiting, as Gabriel stood between two truths, one too perfect, the other too painful to ignore. The vestry was dim and still, its air carrying the faint scent of incense and polished wood, the hum of whispers from the cathedral muffled by heavy doors. Gabriel closed them carefully behind him, his hand still resting lightly on Lily's shoulder as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. The girl stood small and tense in the quiet room, her notebook clutched tightly against her chest. His heart was pounding, his thoughts torn between frustration, confusion, and the weight of the scene she had just caused. He wanted to believe she had only been overwhelmed by the ceremony, by grief that still lingered from losing her mother, but her eyes were too steady, her voice too raw. "Lily," he said, keeping his tone calm though his nerves were taut as wire, "you need to help me understand." "Why would you say that out there?" His voice carried a note of exhaustion, of a man trying to balance the truth of a child's words against the image of perfection he had built around Serena. Lily opened her notebook with small, shaking hands. The pages were covered in her handwriting, uneven letters pressed hard into the paper, lists and notes she had kept for weeks. She turned the book so he could see, her finger landing on the first page. "Because I've been watching," she whispered, "and I've written everything down." Gabriel lowered himself onto the small wooden bench, his knees bent awkwardly in his expensive suit, his eyes scanning the pages. Lily pointed again, her voice trembling but sure. "When you traveled to Chicago in May, Serena said she was going to stay with her sister, but she didn't. She met a man in the garden outside the cafe on Willow Street. I saw them. They talked for an hour, and when she came back, she said she had been visiting her sister all day." Gabriel frowned, the detail sharp enough to catch his attention. He turned another page, his pulse quickening. "And here," Lily continued, her eyes wide with urgency. "She knew Mr. Ashford's name before you told anyone you had signed the contract. She said it when you were on the phone, and she acted like she had only heard it in passing. But I know you hadn't told her yet. She couldn't have known unless she was listening somehow." The words pressed down on him harder with each sentence. He flipped further into the notebook, seeing another page with careful, jagged writing. "I saw her in your office at night when you were asleep. She used her phone to take pictures of papers on your desk. She put them back exactly where they had been so you wouldn't notice Lily's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, 'I know she's lying. I know she's not what you think.'" Gabriel's chest felt tight, his throat dry. The evidence was not evidence in the way he was used to, hard numbers, contracts, data, but it was detailed, consistent, far too sharp for the imagination of a child. Still, his mind resisted, clinging to Serena's smile, to the softness of her hand in his, to the image of the life he had almost sealed at the altar. "Lily," he said slowly, "these are serious things. Do you understand what it means to say them?" She nodded, her small chin trembling but lifted high. "I understand. But I had to tell you, because if you don't listen now, it will be too late." Gabriel closed the notebook gently, staring at the worn cover, his thoughts racing. He felt the first crack of doubt press against the image of perfection he had been clinging to, and though he wanted to dismiss it, he could not shake the fear that Lily's words were not the ramblings of a frightened child, but the warnings of someone who had seen what he had chosen not to see. The vestry door opened with a sudden sweep, the hinges groaning as Serena stepped inside. Her gown caught the light from the narrow window, every bead on the fabric glittering as if she had walked straight out of a dream. But her eyes were sharp beneath the veil, her posture taut even as she softened her features for Gabriel's sake. She closed the door with more force than necessary, her gaze sliding past Lily as though the child were invisible, fixing only on Gabriel with practiced devotion. "Gabriel," she said, her voice low and trembling, "we need to talk. Alone." She held out a hand, her fingers delicate, her expression painted with the perfect mixture of hurt and patience. "Please, don't let this moment be stolen from us by confusion." Lily shrank closer to Gabriel's side, her notebook pressed against her chest, her eyes blazing with silent protest. Gabriel hesitated, torn between the girl who had laid out her fears with heartbreaking honesty and the woman who was now weeping before him, every line of her body crafted to speak of love, betrayed. Serena moved closer, her perfume filling the room, her voice softening as tears slid down her cheeks. "She doesn't understand what she's saying," she whispered, glancing briefly at Lily before turning her full attention back to Gabriel. "She's been through so much, losing her mother, moving into a new home. Of course she's frightened. Of course she's looking for attention. This," she gestured toward the notebook in Lily's hands, her lips curving in a sorrowful smile, "this is just her way of asking to be seen." Gabriel felt his stomach twist. The explanation was neat, polished, and painfully believable. He had seen Lily's loneliness, her fear of being abandoned again. It was easy to imagine her creating stories to keep his focus, to ensure she mattered. But the details in her notebook, the moments too sharp to be imagined, echoed in his mind like warnings he did not want to hear. Serena stepped closer still, her hand brushing against his, her voice breaking in just the right place. "Do you think I would stand here, in front of everyone we love, on the day I've dreamed of, and plot against you? Do you think I could do that?" Her green eyes shimmered with unshed tears, her gaze steady and full of wounded devotion. Gabriel looked at her, and for a moment he faltered. Her performance was flawless, her every word dripping with sincerity, her every gesture promising loyalty. Behind him, he could still hear the muted murmur of the guests outside, their whispers rising and falling. He knew how they would see this, an elegant woman humiliated by a child's interruption, a bride wronged in the most public way possible. Already the sympathy of the crowd was tilting toward Serena, their unease settling into soft pity for the woman who stood so gracefully under suspicion. Lily tugged at Gabriel's sleeve, her eyes wet, but her voice steady as she whispered, "She's lying. Please don't let her trick you." Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, caught between two forces pulling at his heart. Serena's hand, warm and convincing, pressed against his, while Lily's small fingers clung with desperate faith. The room felt tighter, the air heavier, as the man who had built an empire on clear choices and hard facts now stood unable to tell which truth to believe. The corridors of the cathedral were hushed, the echo of voices from the main hall muffled by heavy stone walls. Lily had slipped away from the vestry after Serena's sharp words had cut through her, her small legs carrying her down a narrow passage, until she found herself in a quiet alcove near the sacristy. She curled into the corner, her notebook pressed tight to her chest, her tears dampening the worn cover. She had tried. She had spoken when it mattered most. but already she could feel the shift of the crowd, the way the whispers had turned against her, sympathy flowing towards Serena's trembling voice rather than her own frightened truth. The weight of being unheard pressed down on her small shoulders, familiar and bitter, the same weight she had carried in foster homes where adults always dismissed her words as imagination or mischief. A soft shuffle of footsteps approached, steady and unhurried, followed by the faint scent of lavender and linen. Josephine Alvarez appeared, her dark hair streaked with silver pulled neatly back, her posture dignified despite her age. She had been with Gabriel since his parents were alive, managing his household with quiet precision, and though she moved in the background of his life, she carried the kind of presence that filled a room without noise. Her sharp eyes softened as she saw Lily, her lips pressing into a line of concern. Without asking questions, Josephine lowered herself onto the wooden bench opposite the child, her knees creaking with the effort, and waited. Lily wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand, embarrassed by her tears. But Josephine reached into her pocket and offered her a handkerchief, white and carefully folded. "You did something very brave," Josephine said gently, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had seen many storms. "But bravery does not always feel good right away." Lily clutched the handkerchief, her small fingers twisting it, and whispered, "No one believes me. She makes them all think I'm just a kid who doesn't understand. But I know what I saw." Her voice cracked, but her eyes glowed with that stubborn determination Josephine had long admired. Josephine leaned forward slightly, her sharp gaze holding Lily's. "Tell me," she said. "What did you see?" And so Lily opened her notebook again, her small hand pointing to the pages filled with notes, recounting the nights Serena whispered on the phone, the afternoons she asked strange questions, the times Lily saw her slipping into Gabriel's office. Josephine listened without interruption, her face unreadable, but when Lily finished, her hand dropped onto the child's gently. "You are not wrong," Josephine said at last. "I have noticed things too. The way her eyes follow Gabriel's desk more than his face, the times she lingers in rooms where she does not belong, and the way her smile hardens when she thinks no one is watching." Lily's breath caught, relief washing over her features. "So you believe me?" she whispered. Josephine's expression softened into something close to affection. "I do. And you are not alone anymore. Together, we will watch more carefully, and together, we will protect Gabriel. He may not see it yet, but the truth always finds a way through the lies." For the first time that day, Lily's tears slowed, the ache in her chest easing. Someone was finally listening. Someone saw what she saw. In that moment, the weight of being small and unheard lifted just enough for her to believe she could keep fighting. Gabriel sat alone in the vestry after Serena had swept out with her veil trailing behind her like a banner of wounded pride. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving him in silence, though the faint hum of voices from the cathedral drifted in as a reminder that hundreds of people were waiting for him to make a choice. He leaned back against the wooden bench, his hand running through his dark hair, his thoughts restless. The image of Lily's tear-streaked face would not leave him. Her words had been raw, stripped of performance, spoken with the painful urgency of someone who had nothing to gain except being heard. She had looked at him with such determination that it had pierced straight through the armor of logic he always wore. And yet, Serena's voice echoed in his head just as strongly. Her tears had seemed real, her pleas had carried warmth, and her touch had been soft in his hand. She had looked at him with the devotion he had always longed for, but rarely trusted. Her explanations had been neat and believable, painting Lily as a grieving child desperate for attention. It was an answer that fit too easily, but it was also an answer he wanted to accept. Gabriel leaned forward, pressing his elbows against his knees, trying to steady his breathing. But as he sat there, fragments of memory began to push their way through. Little moments he had dismissed at the time. Serena's uncanny timing, arriving at his office with coffee just as he finished tense calls, smiling with reassurance as if she had known the exact moment he would need her. Her sudden habit of tidying his papers when she visited, her fingers lingering too long on folders that had nothing to do with her. the questions she slipped into casual conversations about his travel plans, his meetings, his associates, questions that had felt harmless then but now tasted like probes, carefully placed to collect information. He remembered one night in particular, when he had come home earlier than expected. Serena had been standing in his office, the glow of the desk lamp casting her shadow long across the wall. She had jumped when he walked in, laughing quickly as she said she had been looking for a pen. He had accepted the excuse because she had looked so beautiful in the light, but the unease he had felt then pressed against him now, sharp and undeniable. The more he thought, the more the seeds of doubt dug in. Lily's notebook, filled with her careful handwriting, the detail of her observations, lined up with the unease he had buried under excuses. Could a child have invented all that? Could a child have noticed things he, a man trained to look for deception in business, had ignored? His chest tightened as the question refused to leave him. But even with the doubts rising, he could not let go of Serena's polished charm. She was everything people expected him to have, the perfect partner who fit into the world he had built. To doubt her was to admit he had been blind, that the love he thought he had found was nothing but a mask. He rubbed his temples, caught between the brutal honesty of a child's warning and the comforting beauty of a woman's devotion, knowing he could not cling to both for long. The reception had stalled, the guests restless as whispers flowed like a current through the cathedral. The music had faded into silence and the priest had retreated, leaving the grand hall filled with unease. Serena moved among the crowd with practiced grace, her smile a careful mixture of wounded dignity and patient charm, speaking to the guests as if nothing could shake her composure. People admired her elegance, murmuring about how gracefully she was handling the interruption, how strong she must be to stand tall while a child tried to unravel her day. To most, she seemed untouchable, but Lily watched from the shadows near the side door, her eyes sharp, her notebook clutched in one hand like a shield. She had seen how easily Serena twisted words, how quickly adults leaned toward believing the woman in white rather than the little girl with trembling hands. If she wanted to be heard, she needed more than warnings. She needed proof. The idea frightened her, but the determination in her chest was stronger than the fear. She slipped away while Serena was surrounded by guests, her soft laugh echoing across the marble floor, and crept toward the room where the bride had left her belongings. The air in the small cloakroom smelled faintly of perfume and flowers. On the table, beside Serena's clutch, rested her phone, its glass screen dark. Lily's heart hammered as she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting Serena to appear at the doorway. She reached out with shaking hands and picked it up, her breath catching at the weight of it, heavy not because of the device itself, but because of what it might contain. She pressed the screen and the phone lit up, revealing no password, only a simple swipe. Lily almost smiled. Serena had always been too confident, too sure of her own control to imagine someone would dare touch what belonged to her. Lily opened the messages, her small finger scrolling carefully. At first there were harmless conversations, the kind of exchanges any adult might have, but then she found them, the messages that carried no warmth at all. Victor. The name appeared again and again, never explained, never introduced, only spoken as if both sides already understood everything. Her eyes scanned the short messages, each one sharp and cold. The acquisition is almost complete. The timeline matches. Final step secured once vows exchanged. Lily read them twice, her young mind grasping more than she wished she could. The words were not about love or marriage. They were about strategy, about a plan, about taking something that was not freely given. Her stomach twisted as she placed the phone back exactly as she had found it, every movement careful, deliberate. She slipped out of the cloakroom and hurried down the hallway, her shoes barely making a sound against the floor, until she found Josephine standing by the side of the reception hall, watching with the calm eyes of someone who saw more than she said. Lily pulled at her sleeve, her voice a hushed whisper filled with urgency. "I found messages. She's writing to someone named Victor. They're talking about an acquisition and a timeline." Josephine's gaze sharpened, her lips tightening as she bent closer. "Show me," she said softly, and Lily opened her notebook, scribbling the words as quickly as she could remember them. Josephine's face grew grim as she read. For the first time since the ceremony had shattered, Lily felt a flicker of relief. She was no longer standing alone. Gabriel stood near the tall arched window of the vestry, the light filtering through colored glass painting fractured patterns across his dark suit. He felt the weight of the stalled wedding pressing against him, the muffled voices of restless guests reminding him that the world was still waiting for a decision. He rubbed his temples, exhausted, when the door opened quietly and Josephine stepped inside, her calm presence filling the space. Beside her was Lily, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest, her eyes wide but steady. Josephine guided Lily forward, her hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder. "Mr. Gabriel," she said gently, her voice low but carrying an authority sharpened over decades of loyalty. "Lily has something important to share with you, and I believe it is time you listened." Lily's small hands shook as she opened her notebook, flipping to the page where she had scrawled the words she had just copied from Serena's phone. "She's been writing to someone named Victor," Lily whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "They talk about the acquisition and the timeline. It's not about you. It's not about marriage. It's about your company." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at him. "She's planning something, and I think she's lying to everyone." Josephine placed the notebook in Gabriel's hands, her expression grave. "I saw the words myself. This is no invention. The child has noticed more than any of us." Before Gabriel could respond, the door swung open again and Serena stepped in, her veil shimmering as if the very light bent toward her. Her eyes flicked to the notebook in his hands, then to Lily's pale face. For the briefest second, the mask slipped, irritation flashing like a crack in porcelain, but then her expression softened into wounded disbelief. She clasped her hands in front of her, her voice breaking with perfect precision. "So, this is what it comes to?" she said softly, her gaze fixed on Gabriel. "You don't trust me because of a child's jealousy?" Her words dripped with sorrow, yet they wrapped around him like silk. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for him, her voice lowering to a whisper meant only for him. "She lost her mother, Gabriel. She's terrified of losing you too. Of course she's acting out. But you, of all people, should see through this." Her tears were flawless, shimmering trails against her skin, and her voice carried such conviction that Gabriel's chest tightened. For a moment he faltered, his resolve shaking. He had seen this face countless times, smiling at him with warmth, comforting him with sweetness, whispering promises of loyalty. Now she stood before him, her beauty almost painful, her grief so convincing he wanted to believe her. He wanted to dismiss the notebook in his hands, to believe Lily was only overwhelmed, to go back to the dream of certainty Serena offered. Lily's voice cut through the haze, trembling but unyielding. "She's lying," she whispered again. "Please don't let her trick you." Gabriel looked between the woman who embodied everything he thought he wanted and the child who carried nothing but truth. His heart pounded as he realized how close he was to breaking, how easily Serena's honeyed words nearly pulled him back into the web she had woven around him. The vestry seemed smaller, the silence heavier, as he stood caught between two worlds, knowing only one of them could be real. The evening air outside the cathedral carried the faint scent of roses from the garden, a soft breeze moving through the tall hedges and stone archways. Guests had begun to drift into clusters, their voices buzzing with speculation about the wedding's delay. But the garden remained quiet, a place where the whispers from the hall could not reach. Lily had slipped away unnoticed, her notebook and tablet tucked close against her chest. She had learned long ago that when adults stopped listening, she had to look harder, watch closer, and today that instinct had guided her into the shadows of the garden. She crouched near the stone fountain, hidden by the curve of hedges, when the crunch of footsteps drew her still. Serena's voice floated into the open air, no longer the careful tone of a wounded bride, but sharper, stripped of sweetness. "He almost believed me," she said, her words laced with irritation. "The girl is the only problem. She sees too much." Another voice answered, Deeper, familiar. Lily's chest tightened as she recognized it. Victor, Gabriel's business partner. The man who had sat at their dining table many nights, laughing with Gabriel, planning strategies, raising glasses of wine to celebrate victories. His voice was colder now, confident in the shadows. She's just a child. Gabriel will dismiss her. He always chooses logic over instinct. He trusts me more than anyone else. That's what makes this so easy. Lily pressed her hand over her mouth to stop a gasp from escaping. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. Serena's laugh was soft but merciless. Once the vows are spoken, his holdings are as good as ours. I've already mapped out access to his accounts, and with your position in the company, everything will fall neatly into place. Victor's tone was calculated, the same voice that once reassured Gabriel during boardroom battles. We'll keep him in place long enough to finalize the merger. After that, we strip it all down. Shares, patents, even the algorithm he guards so carefully. He'll be left with nothing. And if he resists, we'll ruin his reputation so no one will trust him again. The words struck Lily like stones, each one heavier than the last. She forced her trembling fingers to unlock her tablet and pressed record, the red light blinking faintly as the device captured every word. Serena's heels clicked softly against the stone as she moved closer to Victor. "And the girl?" she asked with quiet venom. "She's inconvenient. Too observant." Victor's reply was swift, ruthless. "She won't matter once this is finished. Foster children are forgotten easily. No one will listen to her once Gabriel is broken." Tears blurred Lily's vision, but her hand stayed steady on the tablet. She knew she was holding more than words now. She was holding proof, the kind Gabriel could not ignore, the kind no performance could cover. She crouched lower, hidden by the hedges, while Serena and Victor continued plotting, their voices weaving a plan of betrayal in the very place meant for vows of loyalty and love. When they finally walked away, their silhouettes disappearing into the shadows, Lily stayed frozen, her breath shallow. Then she looked down at the recording glowing on her screen, her small fingers tightening around the tablet. For the first time that day, she felt the balance shift. She was no longer just a frightened child crying out for someone to believe her. She was a witness with proof, and with it, she would protect the man who had given her a home, no matter the cost. The cathedral doors opened once more, and the guests turned in their seats as Serena reappeared at Gabriel's side, her veil smoothed, her expression serene as if nothing had disturbed the day at all. Her hand slid gracefully into his arm, her smile perfectly timed, her voice soft enough to sound fragile, yet strong enough for everyone to hear. "We cannot let fear or confusion take this day from us," she said, her words floating through the church like a hymn. "Gabriel, let us continue. Let us prove that love cannot be broken by misunderstanding." Her confidence was a shield, polished and gleaming, and Gabriel, weary from the weight of suspicion and doubt, found himself nodding slowly. He felt the eyes of his guests on him, waiting for his decision, and the thought of leaving them in uncertainty any longer seemed unbearable. Serena's grip on his arm tightened almost imperceptibly, guiding him back to the altar as though it were his own choice. The guests whispered their approval, admiring her grace, and the priest cleared his throat nervously as he stepped forward once more. The organ swelled again, the music filling the vaulted ceiling with sound. The guests straightened in their seats, the tension melting into relief. It seemed the interruption had been just that, a childish outburst soon forgotten. Serena lifted her chin with radiant poise, her gown trailing behind her like a river of silk, her eyes glimmering with victory. She had turned scandal into sympathy, suspicion into admiration, and in that moment she looked untouchable. But Lily had not given up. She moved quietly through the pews, her small figure nearly invisible against the towering presence of adults around her. Her notebook was tucked under her arm, but in her hands she clutched the tablet that now carried the most important truth of the day. She slipped toward Josephine, who stood near the side aisle with watchful eyes, her posture calm yet alert. Lily tugged gently at her sleeve, her whisper urgent but steady. "I recorded them," she said, her breath quick but sure. Serena and Victor. They said everything. They want to take the company, to leave Gabriel with nothing. It's all on here. She pressed the tablet into Josephine's hands, her eyes wide with both fear and determination. You have to show him before it's too late. Josephine looked down at the glowing screen, the red recording bar still visible, and her sharp eyes softened with pride. She reached out and touched Lily's cheek briefly, a gesture of reassurance, before sliding the tablet discreetly into her purse. You've done more than anyone expected of you, little one, she murmured. Now let me take care of the rest. At the altar, Gabriel tried to steady his thoughts as the priest resumed the vows. Serena's hand rested against his, warm and perfectly timed with a tremble that reminded everyone of the ordeal she had endured. She glanced at the crowd with moist eyes, every movement painting her as the devoted bride overcoming cruelty with grace. The guests watched with softened expressions, believing the worst had passed, believing they were witnessing resilience and love. But just before Serena could speak her vows, Josephine stepped closer to the front pew, her fingers brushing the tablet hidden at her side, her eyes meeting Gabriel's. The balance of the ceremony was about to shift again, though Serena glowed as if she had already won. The cathedral seemed to hold its breath as the priest's voice rang out, steady and solemn, asking the question everyone had been waiting for. Do you, Serena Vale, take Gabriel Stone? The words echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling, carrying through the rows of polished pews, each syllable weighted with tradition and expectation. Serena's face glowed beneath her veil, her smile soft and angelic, her posture flawless as she prepared to answer. The guests leaned forward slightly, eager to hear the moment of promise that would complete the fairy tale. But before Serena could open her mouth, a small voice cut through the hush. Wait, Lily cried, her voice piercing the silence, stronger than before, steadier now that she knew she was not alone. The sound startled the crowd, and heads turned sharply, whispers rising in confusion. Gabriel's heart clenched at the interruption, torn between frustration and fear, his eyes flicking toward his niece who stood in the aisle once more, her small figure brave against the tide of expectation pressing down on her. Serena's smile faltered for the first time, her lips tightening, though she quickly recovered, her expression tilting into a wounded plea. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking in just the right places. Don't let her do this again. She's a child, Gabriel. She's scared. She doesn't understand. Her hand tightened on his, her nails digging lightly into his skin beneath the lace of her sleeve, urging him to stay with her, to ignore the interruption. But then Josephine stepped forward, her quiet dignity commanding more authority than the rush of Serena's performance. She held Gabriel's gaze for a brief moment, then lifted the tablet Lily had given her. With a flick of her finger, the recording filled the cathedral, Serena's voice spilling into the sacred space, no longer sweet or gentle, but sharp, cold, and calculating. He almost believed me, Serena's voice said through the speakers, dripping with disdain. The girl is the only problem. She sees too much. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation, the sound swelling like a wave. Guests turned wide-eyed toward the bride, disbelief etching across their faces as the recording continued. Another voice joined in, Victor's, familiar and trusted, Gabriel's own partner. He trusts me more than anyone else. That's what makes this so easy. The words hung in the air like poison, the truth undeniable as Serena's laughter, low and merciless, echoed through the cathedral. Once the vows are spoken, his holdings are as good as ours. With your position, everything will fall into place. The guests recoiled, the whispers growing into sharp cries of shock and outrage. Mothers covered their children's ears, old friends shook their heads in disbelief, and business associates muttered furiously, realizing they were hearing the unraveling of a man's life plotted in secret. Gabriel's face turned pale, his breath catching as the voice of the woman he thought he loved revealed itself as nothing but deceit. Serena stood frozen, her mask cracking, her beauty unable to soften the venom in the words that betrayed her. Her tears could no longer save her, because they were drowned out by the evidence of her own voice. The cathedral that had moments earlier been filled with admiration and hope was now a chamber of exposed lies, and Gabriel felt the final thread of denial snap inside him. The truth was undeniable, and everyone had heard it. The recording ended in a silence so deep, it felt as if the cathedral itself was holding its breath. Serena's face drained of color, her hands trembling as the weight of her own voice echoed in every corner of the room. For a heartbeat, she stood frozen, her mask of grace slipping away. Then with a sharp inhale, she forced a brittle laugh, her tone high and frantic. "This is absurd," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned whispers. "A trick, that's all. Someone has doctored this, spliced my voice, twisted it to make me look like a monster." She turned to the guests, her veil shaking with the movement, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence. "You all know me. You've seen me with Gabriel. Do you really think I would plot against him like that?" But no one spoke in her defense. The polished charm that had captivated the room minutes earlier was gone, replaced by the raw sound of her cold laughter in the recording, by the calculating words that had stripped her love bare and revealed it for what it truly was. The whispers grew sharper, people pulling back as if distance could shield them from the betrayal they had just witnessed. Gabriel stared at her, his chest tight, his thoughts twisting as the image of the woman he thought he knew collided with the evidence he could not ignore. For weeks, he had brushed aside unease, convincing himself her questions were harmless, her timing coincidence, her late-night calls meaningless. Now the truth stood naked before him, her beauty nothing more than a mask, her devotion a performance. The final thread of denial snapped inside him, and for the first time he truly saw Serena Vale not as the woman he had almost married, but as the architect of his ruin. Across the hall, a sudden movement caught his eye. Victor, who had been seated among the front rows, slipped from his pew with the silence of a man practiced in escape. He kept his head low, moving swiftly toward the side doors. But security, already alerted by Josephine's quiet foresight, intercepted him before he reached the exit. 2 guards stepped into his path, firm hands gripping his arms as he tried to twist away, his face contorted with the frustration of a plan unraveling. The crowd gasped again, horror spreading as they recognized Gabriel's business partner, the man they had seen standing proudly beside him at countless events, now revealed as an accomplice to betrayal. Victor spat curses under his breath, his voice low but vicious, yet his resistance did little against the grip of the guards. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some staring in disbelief, others shaking their heads, unable to reconcile the man they once respected with the treachery laid bare. The cathedral, which only an hour ago had been a stage for celebration, now felt like a courtroom, every guest a witness to the collapse of lies. Serena turned back to Gabriel, her face pale and desperate, her voice trembling now without polish. "Gabriel, you can't believe this," she pleaded, her mask broken into shards of panic and fury. But he met her eyes at last, and for the first time there was no hesitation, no longing, no doubt. Only the cold recognition of truth. The cathedral doors burst open with a heavy echo, and the sound of polished shoes on marble carried through the vast space. Uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence cutting through the stunned whispers of the guests. The moment felt unreal, like a scene from a courtroom drama unfolding inside a sacred hall. Josephine, calm and steady, stepped forward from the side aisle, her hand raised in subtle acknowledgement. She had made the call earlier, her instincts sharper than anyone had realized, ensuring that when the truth finally broke open, there would be no chance for escape. Serena's head snapped toward the officers, her poise unraveling in an instant. She tried to gather herself, to summon the performance that had carried her so far, but her hands shook and her words stumbled. "This is a mistake," she cried, her voice ringing with desperation. "I'm the bride. I belong here." "You don't understand. I'm the victim in all this." She reached toward Gabriel as if his name alone could save her, but the officers moved swiftly, their hands firm as they clasped her wrists and pulled them behind her back. The cold click of handcuffs cut through the cathedral like the toll of a bell. Gasps rippled through the guests, some covering their mouths, others turning away from the sight. To see Serena Vale, the woman who had dazzled them with beauty and grace, reduced to a figure trembling in the grasp of law enforcement, was almost too much to comprehend. Her mask was gone now, stripped away by her own voice and her own ambition, leaving only the sharp edges of deceit that had driven her. She twisted in the officer's hold, her eyes flashing with rage even as tears streaked her face. "Gabriel," she shouted, her voice cracking, "you can't let them do this to me. You know I love you. Don't let them take me." But Gabriel did not move. He stood rooted to the floor, his chest tight, his thoughts heavy with betrayal. To watch the woman he had almost promised his life to dragged out in chains was like watching a dream collapse into ashes. The pain was sharper than anger, deeper than disbelief. It was the kind of wound that bled quietly, unseen but devastating. Victor's struggle was more violent. He cursed as the officers closed in, his face twisted with fury, his once polished composure shattered. He tried to pull free, but two men held him fast, dragging him toward the doors. Guests recoiled as he passed. The man they had toasted at boardroom dinners and celebrated at company milestones, now revealed as a traitor. His partnership with Gabriel had once been spoken of as unbreakable, a bond built on trust and ambition. But now it lay in ruins, exposed for what it truly was, an arrangement Victor had been exploiting from the very beginning. Gabriel's eyes followed them as they were led away, Serena's cries fading into echoes that clung to the high arches of the cathedral. The woman he had thought he loved, the woman he had almost made his wife, was nothing more than an actress playing a role. He felt the betrayal like fire in his chest, searing and unrelenting, and though he stood tall, inside he knew it would be a long time before the burn of this day would fade. Weeks had passed since the cathedral had become the stage for betrayal, and yet the memory still lingered in Gabriel's mind like the echo of a wound that refused to close. The headlines had told the story to the world: Serena Vale exposed, Victor arrested, a network of deceit pulled apart piece by piece. But within the walls of Gabriel's mansion, life had shifted in quieter, more lasting ways. Where once the air had been heavy with tension and performance, now there was something softer, something Gabriel had not realized he had been missing until it filled every corner. The paperwork sat neatly on his desk, signed and sealed, the legal stamp fresh against the page. Lily Hart was no longer only his responsibility by promise, but his daughter in the eyes of the law. Gabriel leaned back in his chair as the weight of it sank in, a different kind of weight than the pressure of his company or the sharp sting of betrayal. This was the kind of weight that settled into his chest with warmth, not burden, the kind that reminded him of his sister, of promises made, of the duty he had once thought was obligation, but had become love. The mansion no longer looked the way Serena had shaped it. Her stage decor, carefully chosen to impress, had been stripped away. The rooms that once felt like galleries of her taste now carried Lily's laughter, her school books stacked on the dining table, her shoes kicked off by the door. On the walls hung not abstract pieces meant to signal sophistication, but Lily's drawings, framed carefully by Josephine. Bright pictures of gardens, of smiling faces, of a family she had begun to believe in. Each one was imperfect, the colors uneven, but to Gabriel they were the truest art the house had ever displayed. Josephine moved through the rooms with her quiet presence, her calm steadying both of them. She had been the one to guide Lily when the world had doubted her, the one to remind Gabriel of truths he had not wanted to see. Now she seemed lighter too, her steps softer, her eyes filled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had kept a promise through storm and fire. She cooked meals Lily loved, she filled the evenings with gentle conversation, and she reminded Gabriel that a home was not built with appearances, but with care. Lily herself was different. The shadows in her eyes had not disappeared completely, but there was a new confidence in the way she moved through the house. She no longer clutched her notebook every moment, afraid no one would hear her unless she had proof. Instead, she left her tablet charging on the counter, her notebook open on her desk, her trust growing in the safety around her. She skipped through the garden, her laughter rising into the air, and sometimes when she caught Gabriel watching, she would smile without hesitation, as though she knew now that he would always be there. Gabriel stood one evening in the hallway, his gaze resting on a drawing she had hung herself. 3 figures stood hand in hand beneath a blue sky, the tallest with dark hair, the smallest with a bright dress, the one in the middle older and strong. Beneath it she had written in uneven letters, "Our family." Gabriel reached out, his fingers brushing the frame, and for the first time in weeks the burn of betrayal gave way to something softer, something stronger. The family that remained was not the one he had expected, but it was the one that mattered. The quiet after the storm was unlike anything Gabriel had ever known. For years his life had been measured in contracts and board meetings, in the rise and fall of numbers that never seemed to stop climbing, in the endless chase for more. He had thought that was what life meant, the pursuit of wealth, the building of empire, the power of influence. Yet standing now in the center of his home, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and laughter echoed down hallways that had once been silent, Gabriel felt something far greater than power. He felt the strength of a family that had been built not on performance or appearances, but on truth. It had not come easily. The betrayals had cut deep, and the scars of deception would always remain in his memory, but they no longer defined him. What defined him now was the little girl who had spoken when no one else dared, who had lifted the veil of lies with her small but steady voice. Lily had not known the full cost of her words, but she had known what was right, and that had changed everything. Gabriel often thought about that, how it had been her courage, not his, that had broken the chains Serena and Victor had wrapped so tightly around his life. One evening, as the fire crackled low in the hearth, Gabriel sat with Lily and Josephine in the living room. Josephine had her knitting in her lap, her calm presence steady as always, and Lily was sprawled on the rug with colored pencils scattered around her. She was working on another drawing, this one of the garden they had planted together, where roses and wildflowers now bloomed in place of the carefully staged arrangements Serena had once demanded. The picture was bright and hopeful, a reflection of the world Lily was learning to trust. Gabriel watched her in silence for a while before speaking, his voice low, carrying the weight of gratitude. "Lily," he said, and she looked up at him with those wide, searching eyes that had once carried fear, but now held growing trust. "You saved me. You saved all of us. I want you to know that I will never forget what you did." She tilted her head, as though she didn't quite understand the depth of his words, but she smiled, and he knew she felt the truth behind them. Later that night, after Josephine had gone upstairs and the house had grown quiet, Gabriel tucked Lily into bed. She held her favorite stuffed bear close, the one Josephine had found for her in the city, and looked at him with a softness that broke his heart. For so long she had been forced to guard herself, to hold her truths like secrets, but now she could rest without fear. As he smoothed her blanket, she whispered, her voice gentle but certain, "Now we're safe." Gabriel froze, his chest tightening, and then he smiled, bending to kiss her forehead. Those words, spoken with peace instead of desperation, were the truest fortune he could ever hold. Not the empire he had built, not the wealth he had gathered, but this family forged by honesty, by trust, by love. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.